أيتها السيدات أيها السادة
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning.
ونحن مع الجلسة الثانية
We are now beginning the second session of the third day about this conference, which is the Arab world and USA. This session will be for 1 hour and a half.
بمعنى أننا
That's to say, we will this session will come to its end at 1 o'clock. This session's topic is U.S. relations with regional and international powers and the repercussions on the Arab states. The speakers will be a number of dear colleagues: John Parker, Hamid Dabashi, Omar al-Zobidy, Kadir, Ustun. I will give each speaker 15 minutes. And in the beginning, I will present Mr. John Parker. For those who don't know Mr. Parker, for whom we have read so many publications, he has published several books about this topic. He is an associate scholar in research in the National Defense University, and he is also a researcher in politics, public politics, in Woodrow Wilson Center. I wish the principles of Wilson are still valid and applied to our day and throughout the 20th century, but unfortunately they have changed with Lyndon Johnson's. He also has many publications, and he is a lecturer in political analysis, and especially lately about Russia and Eurasia and the State Department of the United States since 1974. And he has completed 2 missions in the American Embassy in Moscow and obtained his PhD from Yale University. I give him the floor. Mr. John Parker, the floor is yours. He will be speaking about.
Thank you, Dr. Dahil. And a big thanks to the Arab Center for inviting all of us to this very important conference today and the past 2 days. And good morning, dear conference colleagues. It's finally our third and last day. But it seems like just yesterday, on February 16th, that I received the invitation from the Arab Center to speak today on Russian policy in the Middle East. It was going to be so easy, but then just a week later, Putin decided to annex Crimea. All of a sudden, speculation turned to the impact of the Kremlin's forceful handling of the Ukrainian crisis on Russia's policy towards the Middle East, especially Syria and Iran. There had clearly been what we call a paradigm shift in Putin's approach to the United States and the West. Would there also be a paradigm shift in Putin's approach to the Middle East? My own view is that the Crimea decision was actually made in the context of an already evolving harder line on Syria rather than the other way around. Since that Crimea decision, nearly 4 months have passed, so it's a good time to take a fresh look at the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on Russian policy in the Middle East. Fortunately, with the Arab Center's help, I visited Moscow just last week. There, I interviewed 10 Russian experts on the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on Russia's policy toward the Middle East. So what I would like to do today is to give you a sense of what they told me, a composite, so to speak, or a sampler of what I heard in Moscow. I'll first highlight 6 general themes I heard that apply across the Middle East, and then I'll touch more specifically on Russia's relations with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. So the general themes. First, my Russian contacts told me, it is too early to know how the Ukrainian crisis will develop, and therefore how it will impact on the Middle East. It all depends on the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on Russia's relations with the United States and the West. We do not know how this issue, Russia's differences with the United States and Europe over Ukraine, will be resolved. If not resolved, there will be less incentive for Russia and the West to compromise in the Middle East. Otherwise, my Russian colleagues argue, there is no direct linkage between the Ukrainian crisis and Russia's policy towards the Middle East. So the Ukrainian crisis so far does not directly affect any specific Russian policies in the Middle East, my Russian friends said. However, some pointed out, Russia will have to redirect some resources to the Crimea that it might otherwise have invested in the Middle East or elsewhere. And with reinforcement of the Black Sea Fleet, Russia eventually will be able to deploy more naval forces to the Mediterranean. The second theme I heard in Moscow was that Ukraine has eclipsed Syria and the Middle East. Syria has not been mentioned much for the last few months. The Russian mass media have left the Syrian topic alone. Now the big powers are just looking at Syria with peripheral vision out of the sides of their eyes. Eventually, Russia and the United States will define themselves in Syria by how they solve the Ukrainian crisis, one Russian expert argued. The most important thing for the West is to restrain Putin in Ukraine, he thought, and not aggravate Putin in Syria. So, this Russian colleague told me, if Putin is able to regulate the situation in Ukraine, Obama may not respond to Assad's provocations in Syria. The third general theme I heard concerned Putin's approval ratings in Russia itself. Ukraine has been far more important for Putin's ratings than Syria ever was, Russian observers told me. Putin's approval rating is now sky high at 83%. From the beginning, Russia has had no real concrete interest in Syria, Russian experts on the Middle East told me. But Syria has been a place for Putin to enhance his domestic and international ratings. Putin has now achieved super high ratings with Crimea, so he does not have to mention Syria as much as before. The fourth general theme concerned the Russian image in the Middle East. Everyone I spoke to in Moscow last week, even observers very critical of Putin, said that the main impact of the Ukrainian crisis had been to improve Russia's image in the Middle East. Putin's annexation of Crimea had shown Russian strength, they thought. That was important for the Arabs, they said. At the Russian Foreign Ministry, my contacts said they were hearing that Russia now gets more respect and is treated as a very serious player in the Middle East. So, in their view, the Ukrainian crisis has helped Russia in the region. The view in Moscow is that the Arabs see the United States as having taken on too much in the Middle East and not delivered. They say that it is in this context that the Arabs judge the Ukrainian crisis. Arabs see Russia as a power that can oppose the United States, and the Arabs like this, is the view in Moscow. Now, the fifth general theme. According to my Russian friends, Russian policy in the Middle East is conservative, not activist. And this is good, they believe, because no one can do much to solve the problems of the Middle East. Russia deals with what it has at hand. If the Muslim Brotherhood is in power in Egypt, Russia deals with it. If Sisi is in power, Russia deals with him. Whatever is there, Russia deals with it. This is the correct policy, Russian experts on the Middle East say. Even if you regard Sisi as not legitimate, you have to deal with him eventually. So better deal with him sooner rather than later. There are no possibilities for a more active Russian policy in the Middle East in this view. There are simply too many problems and no solutions. All understand this, my Russian colleagues said, even the United States. The sixth and final general theme I'll touch on is that, according to those Russian experts I talked with, Russia's response to American sanctions may be strategic, not tactical. In Moscow, they say the desire now is to localize the Ukrainian conflict. I heard this a lot. Putin has no desire to annex any more territory in Ukraine beyond Crimea. And Moscow will not go out of its way to spoil what America is doing elsewhere in the world, including in the Middle East. Of course, they said, if US sanctions increase, this is possible, but tit for tat is not profitable for Russia, one said, and this is because Russia has far fewer tits than the United States has tats. Russia's response, one of my contacts speculated, is therefore more likely to be strategic. For example, Russia may try to reduce the level of US-controlled economic globalization. Russia could work through the BRICS and other countries to try to lessen US economic domination of the world. In any event, Moscow does not want to simply engage in a war of gestures with the United States, they thought. Now on to more specific issues. First, Russia-Iran. What will be the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on Russia's relations with Iran? The answer I repeatedly heard was that it will all depend on how successful the P5+1 nuclear talks are. There is still a lot of opposition to Rouhani, Russian experts on Iran told me. But after July 20, the current deadline for the nuclear talks to conclude, maybe the Rouhani government will be able to take bigger steps towards Saudi Arabia and the United States. If the P5+1 talks are successful and sanctions on Iran are removed, then Iran will be less interested in what they call strategic partnership with Russia. However, if the talks are not successful, Iran will be more interested in strategic partnership with Russia. But in general, Russia is not that interested in strategic partnership with Iran. Iran will always be a difficult partner, say those Russians who have followed the issue for a long time. On the other hand, some observers in Moscow argued the Ukrainian crisis has actually stimulated Russian-Iranian cooperation. They said that Putin and Rouhani had in effect agreed last month when they met in Shanghai on what they called a strategic dialogue. Russia needs closer cooperation with Iran, these advocates of such cooperation told me. Opponents can delay the process, they argued, but they cannot stop it. And they had in mind opponents both in Moscow and in Tehran. It could take 1 to 2 years, they thought, and the Ukrainian crisis will definitely influence the process. If Ukraine gets worse, the process of improving relations with Iran will accelerate. There is a lot of mistrust between Russia and Iran, they conceded, but for Russia right now, these advocates of closer relations argued it is better for Russia to cooperate with Iran and create a strategic partnership. Of what benefit would this be to Russia, I asked. It would be important for Russia's role in the Middle East as a whole, these Russian supporters of strategic partnership with Iran told me. Now, Russia is a weak actor in the region. For Russia to be strong, it needs a partner in the region. They pointed out that discussions are now underway between Russia and Iran for resolving the S-300 issue. They thought the issue might be resolved when Putin and Rouhani meet on the margins of the Caspian Summit this autumn in Astrakhan. Others, however, argue that the Iranians will never get the S-300 from Russia. Why? Because for Putin, friendship with Israel is more important than friendship with Iran. There is no Iranian lobby in the US Congress, they pointed out, but Putin knows that there is a very powerful pro-Israeli AIPAC lobby in Washington. These skeptics believe that strategic partnership with Iran is impossible because the Iranians cannot be strategic partners with anybody. There needs to be a solid basis for strategic partnership, they said. Either military and/or economic ties could form such a solid basis, but neither exists in this case. Russia is positive about cooperation with Iran, according to them. 2 more minutes, yeah. I still have. The next theme I heard a lot about in Moscow was Saudi Arabia. With Saudi Arabia, there are no prospects at all. Many in Moscow believe this. Prince Bandar's visit to Moscow last year to meet with Putin ended with nothing achieved. Plus, it is not at all clear what is going on in Riyadh with all the personnel movements in the royal family. Others, however, believe that prospects for Russia's relations with Saudi Arabia are very bright despite Syria. Shifts are underway in Saudi Arabia's policies, they noted. All of these factors and developments are pushing Saudi Arabia towards unexpected moves, they argued. Saudi Arabia is very vulnerable, these Russian experts believe, and does not want Middle East issues to damage its relations with Russia. With Saudi Arabia, they say, there are no real prospects of an improvement in relations, but nevertheless, rapprochement is continuing. This is a paradox, they point out, because it is not a rapprochement among friends. Saudi Arabia is simply looking for international support. All of this is a result of American policy, they argued. If America had been firm, Saudi Arabia would not be interested in making gestures towards Russia. Many in Moscow emphasize that we do not believe the Saudi authorities. For us Russians, they told me, Saudi Arabia is more an enemy than a friend. But, they noted, the Saudis are willing to bankroll Egyptian arms purchases from Russia. So Egypt may prove to be a bridge for Saudi-Russian cooperation. Which brings us to the last theme I'll mention today. With Egypt, so far everything is good, my Russian contacts said. They noted that nostalgia in the region, including in Egypt, for Cold War maneuvering between Moscow and Washington, but they claimed that Russian-Egyptian relations are not developing in this direction right now. They pointed to lots of exaggerated talk about Russian-Egyptian relations, but argued that nothing qualitatively has really changed. My time is up, so I'll stop with this, but I hope that this 15-minute compression of over 10 hours of conversations in Moscow last week gives you some insights into how Russian experts are now viewing the current Kremlin approach to the Middle East. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Prof. John Parker. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much for the presentation by Dr. John Parker on Russia and the prospects of any future developments. We also heard a compression of talks and opinions of 10 hours into 15 minutes. He's done very well in that. Now we have Dr. Hamid Dabashi from Columbia University. He too will be, well, he'll be speaking on the Americans' approach to Iran as of late and in view of the current developments. Dr. Dabashi is from Jacob Kevorkian Center for Iranian Studies and a founding member of the Comparative Literature Society at the university, and is the founder of a Palestinian film to protect the legacy of Palestinian filmmaking, The Dreams of a Nation. Now I invite him to speak. He too will have 15 minutes only. Dr. Dabashi, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Azmi Bishara and his colleagues in the Arab Center for including me in this conversation. I have been asked by my colleagues in the Arab Center to talk about the impact of a potential rapprochement between Iran and the United States on the Arab world. And I would like to begin by saying that the context in which I talk about this potential rapprochement is not the international relationship between two nations and regional politics with giving primacy to the United States, but actually giving primacy to events that are happening in the region. And for me, the most significant is the succession of revolutions in the Arab world that we know them as Arab Spring. These revolutions, for me, are not finished, have not ended. In my recent book on Arab revolutions, which fortunately has just been translated into Arabic, I make a distinction between total revolutions and open-ended revolutions. And I believe what we have witnessed since the Tunisian revolution is precisely this process of open-ended revolution. And if we look at the events in Iraq, probably Iraq, which because of under the US-led occupation was denied the possibility of joining the Arab revolutions early in the course of these events, might be in the at the moment of joining these revolutions if this bugbear of Daesh thing were to be contextualized. But that remains to be seen. So that's the first thing I would like to share, that I'm not going to give primacy to United States interests in the region, but give primacy to the dynamics of Arab revolutions in the context. The second thing I would like to share is that this rapprochement is not going to begin right now in the aftermath of the P+1 negotiations in Geneva surrounding the enrichment of uranium, the reduction of the crippling economic sanctions, the lifting of the military option, and any number of other things, which includes, for example, the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists by Israelis with the full knowledge of Americans, of course, and also encouragement of separatist movements and a number of other objects. But this rapprochement is actually, in a pragmatic level, has been in operation actually over the last 33 years. Iran and US have been cooperating since the time of Khomeini. And in the so-called, the famous Iran-Contra affair, the sort of hostage for military aid, was an indication that even under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran and US were collaborating. That certainly relationship continued in the aftermath of 9/11. When the US-led invasion of Afghanistan happened, Iran provided aerospace to United States. Iran was actively involved in arresting al-Qaeda operatives and handing them over to Americans. When the US-led invasion of Iraq happened, Iran was equally involved in a strategic, and was a strategic beneficiary of that invasion. If you look at the history of this context, the two countries of Afghanistan and Iraq were actually the primary nemesis of the Islamic Republic. And in two successive military operations, United States has knocked down both of these nemesis of United States. So the current negotiations, P+1 in front of Iran, is not something new, but has to be seen in the larger context. And that larger context is, in fact, evident even today. When President Obama called President Rouhani, when President Rouhani was attending the General Assembly in New York, in fact, the question of nuclear negotiation was not primary on President Obama's mind. He wanted to talk about Syria. And the gist of that conversation was revealed subsequently in Iran. And President Obama wanted to talk about Syria and other regional interests of the United States in which Iran can be very helpful, whereas President Rouhani wanted to give primacy to the nuclear negotiations and lifting of the crippling economic sanctions. Now, what it is exactly that Iran can offer United States in the region is the functional equivalent of what Iranians have done with the drone that they downed on Iran, which they reverse engineered and began to produce their own drones and send a mock-it actually to the White House, is reverse engineering of what my distinguished colleague Haifa Zangana just talked about, soft power. Yes, soft power is something that Americans do in the region, but Iranians didn't wait for Professor Joseph Nye to write his book about soft power, and they have been actually cultivating soft power in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, anywhere that US and Israel have gone and bombed. Iranians have gone and cultivated coalitions and cultivated soft power. And the extension of that soft power with Hamas in Palestine, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with various operatives inside Afghanistan, is where they have actual soft power with potentially in Syria metamorphosed into hard power. And today, as we see it in Iraq, that soft power has existed in the form of Maliki's government, but now has actually transformed into hard power, and Iranian forces in the form of Quds Battalion are actually on the ground in Iran. So that range of capabilities of Iran in the region, from Syria and Lebanon and Palestine, potentially even into Bahrain, all the way into Yemen, etc., are precisely the negotiating chips that Iranians have when negotiations of sort of larger negotiations. US is getting ready for a presidential election. President Obama needs to think of his name in history. In fact, the first day after his re-election, he began to meet with American historians, what would be his legacy in American history. So as he is closing down, he wants to finish in Iraq, he wants to finish in Afghanistan, and potentially some sort of a face-saving posture in Syria. And in all of these strategic theaters, Islamic Republic can offer considerable help to President Obama, as you can recently see that, in fact, President Rouhani said in Iraq, we're going to collaborate with United States. So the question of nuclear negotiations, to me, is a red herring, is a manufactured crisis. Iranians have the proposition with which Iranians are now negotiating in Geneva. President Rouhani had drafted precisely the same proposition back in 2006, but President Bush was not ready to accept it. Enrichment under 20%, and right now even the issue of breaking point are not something that Iranians are going to budge. And they will do as is necessary. I think that the nuclear issue is a smokescreen for a larger strategic interest of both United States and Iran in the region, in the context of which they are collaborating. But for our purposes, namely, if we take the initial point of my taking Arab revolutions as the most important events of the succession of events that have happened over the last few years, the issue is the regional alliances and regional coalitions and regional solidarities that have to happen between revolutionary forces. And here, we need to kind of zoom back historically and look at Iranian and Arab relationships in a larger context that does not create a myopic circumstances in which the US is the chief player, and if it oscillates between hard power and soft power, suddenly our understanding of the Arab-Iranian relationship is under the shadow of those changing, the oscillation of policies, as Dr. Marwan Bishara mentioned, disregarding the calculus which remains the same. Here, one can go back any number of points in history. For example, if you go back, say, to the nationalization of Iranian oil back in the 1950s, that is where the real solidarity between the anti-colonial nationalism of Mohammad Mossadegh and Gamal Abdel Nasser and Jawaharlal Nehru was cultivated. And the coup of 1953 is the way that the American and the British interfere in the formation of that anti-colonial nationalism as the most traumatic event in modern Iranian history. If you look at the initial Khomeini's uprising back in June of 1963, it is in the aftermath of that unsuccessful uprising of Khomeini that Ayatollah Khomeini comes to Najaf and spends decades until he moved to Nofle Chateau in late 1970s in Najaf. And the consolidation of the Shi'i clerical power and authority between Najaf and Qom actually happens during the time of Khomeini's exile in Najaf, and the manifestations of which can be seen, in fact, in the solidarities among the Shi'i sectarianism with the move of Ayatollah Khomeini from Iran to Najaf, and obviously extended into Lebanon and even Yemen. Then, if we move to a decade later and the rise of guerrilla uprisings in Iran, of Marxist guerrilla uprisings, there is a direct link between the Cherikhay Fadaye Khalq and the revolutionary forces of PLO and Palestine Liberation Organization. This is another context that we cannot forget, that in the formative years of Iranian revolutionary forces in the 1970s, Fatah and Jabhat Sha'biyeh, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, were definitive to formation of the revolutionary aspirations of Iran prior to its radical Islamization when Khomeini took power. Now, that brings us to the context of the Iranian Revolution of 1977-1979. Here, we need to pay attention to two dialectical forces, internal forces and external forces. Internally, Khomeini came to power in a context that there were at least two serious oppositional forces: anti-colonial nationalism of Mossadegh heritage and third world socialism represented by the Tudeh party and the Cherikhay Fadaye Khalq. from the hostage crisis, 444 days of American hostage crisis, under the smoke screen of American hostage crisis, Khomeini conducted 3 critical phases of the formation of Islamic Republic: the referendum that established Islamic Republic, the first presidential election, and the first parliamentary election, while the attention of the world was distracted to the American hostage crisis. Before the American hostage crisis was over, I'll just finish in just under 1 minute. The Iran-Iraq war started, and again, under that smoke screen, which could have ended within years, if not months, Khomeini perpetuated it for 8 years, and under which the mass execution of political prisoners happened, the cleansing of the revolution, of the universities, the cultural revolutions, etc. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the consolidation, the radical Islamization of the revolution, which was a cosmopolitan and multifaceted revolution, happened in the context of the Iran-Iraq war. However, this is entirely internal. Externally, soon after he came to White House, President Reagan tried to create 2 bumper zones around the Iranian Revolution because it was a massively popular revolution and was of interest to the Arab and Islamic world. One was arming Saddam Hussein, which ended up in the 8-year bloody years of Iran and Iraq, and one was the creation of Mujahideen / Taliban in Afghanistan. The Iran-Iraq war turned a regional revolutionary potential into an Iranian revolution. Saddam Hussein turned it into a second Qadisiyya and that sort of nonsense instead of allowing the revolutionary potentials of the Iranian revolution to spread, whereas the Wahhabi ideology of the Taliban suddenly posited the Iranian revolution, which was not a Shi'i revolution, was a multifaceted revolution, into a Shi'i revolution. And the establishment of the Iranian revolution as a Shi'i Iranian revolution was the beginning of course, the sectarian tension that was generated. To conclude, the actual paper is with the Arab Center. You're welcome to see it. My point is that the pragmatic rapprochement between United States interests, American interests, and Iran, the ruling regime in Iran, not Iranian interests, the ruling regime in Iran, has been in operation over the last 30 plus years, but the state of war that is between the two is actually quite helpful in generating fabricated enemies for both domestic and regional interests. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamid Dabashi, for this invaluable analysis, especially for the issue of the extension of the Iranian extension and its their relations with the others, especially with Iran, with the USA. I had wished that there should be a paper about the history of the relations between USA and the Arabs, so that the topics would be based on a historical basis also. So Dr. Hamid did very well, and now I give the floor to Dr. Omar Ibrahim al-Zobidy, who will be speaking about the impact of the he will be speaking about the American-Iranian relations, managing conflict in the Arab Gulf area. Mr. Omar is head of the C.E.R.S Center for Strategic Studies in Paris. Formerly, he was director on BBC channel in Saudi Arabia, had undertaken several journalistic missions, including being the correspondent of the channel in Saudi, and he has several publications, most important of which is the Saudi Mosaic, and he has obtained his PhD from Canterbury University in Britain. I give him the floor, and I give him 15 minutes only. In the name of God, the most merciful, the my presentation will be on points, on bullet points, so that my colleagues don't go to sleep. I'm talking about the American-Iranian, Iraq-American relations, sometimes as described in a simple way that it's an animosity relationship. But these relations are related to a very important area for or region for the USA. It's not only a region of religious conflict. No, it's a strategic region because it's a crossroads. USA does not look with leisure to its influential regions, and it's not something of a luxury for USA that doesn't decide one day to go to USA, to Asia or to South America. No, each country is important for USA with the increase of interest there, especially if it concerns such strategic commodities such gas and petroleum. America has spent for wars in the past years more than it had spent on development inside the United States. It has spent trillions of dollars directly on military operations and intelligence operations, satellites, technologies, etc. These issues for the United States are sort of investment for the USA. This represents a good dividend and profit, even in creating crises. There was some talk about the past days about the 1973 crisis between Saudi Arabia and the United States. In fact, the United States had profited from that crisis, and anything that is said about the damage to the United States is not true. At that period, in particular, USA had regained Aramco after the fact that Saudi Arabia had nationalized it and nationalized the military base. USA had regained control on Aramco, which is the main source and the main controller of the Saudi Arabian petroleum. This was the beginning of the transfer of billions of dollars, the beginning that led to the Cyprus agreement between Saudi Arabia and three countries, France, Britain, and USA. So it became the center for Saudi Arabian money transfer. So we are now talking about Iranian-American relations. These relations are based on creating tension by the United States. The main problem in our evaluation of what we want from the United States as an ally or a friend. In fact, if we go into waiting that the United States would present good things and present and forget its interests and focus on interests of others, this is something not correct. In fact, USA creates crises or benefits of what exists, such as the case of the crises of the Arab Spring. Other than that, some revolutions are fabricated or some revolutions are only pushed forward by some countries or some parties that are linked to USA. The problem for the United States is that there's more and more demands from its allies. Everybody expects from USA to be a charity organization and to give charity to all the world. This is not realistic. Today, USA brings forward its own interests, and they are the overriding element in their interventions. Although they say that sometimes we intervene there or there to save humanity, but in fact, the United States and all the history of the United States has shown that any intervention it made, whether Bosnia and Iraq, or it would be as an agreement between understandings between the major powers in the world, which is in the benefit of their common interests. For example, the Syrian crisis. The Syrian crisis is a crisis, was in the beginning a real revolution, but then allowed Saudi Arabia, Iran, all the countries to intervene and invest there and achieve their interests there. But when the United States takes sides with they meet with the Russians, they don't discuss Assad. They speak about transitional period and how it should be. Everybody accepts that as long as one has good results. Assad can stay as long as we agree on the mechanisms. But the important thing is not really just the mechanisms. In Moscow and Sochi, in Geneva, and Vienna, the negotiations that take place there discuss specific points. The Russian gas, the arms that are being sold to Iran, or the American presence in the Gulf. That's specific points. These negotiations include issues that are not related to the Assad staying or leaving. So what's discussed on the table is the interests of these four superpowers. And nobody says that we all want to make charity. In fact, USA creates crises in both Koreas. When Kissinger began the secret connection, he used to go to Pakistan and they make secret visits to China so that he can separate or isolate China from the Soviet Union. And this is the role also played now. We in Saudi Arabia, we cannot live without Iran. Saudi Arabia has never lived for one day since its creation without Iran. This is a fact. I can speak about different topics, about negotiations, talks, and they're good or bad, or they're continuing or not, and it's related to the. But everybody in USA agrees that there is tension. Both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, agree on the continuation of the crisis. The jihadist groups are there, and everybody is thinking of personal benefits. The Israelis cannot abandon the billions of dollars they're getting, and Saudi Arabia cannot. Let's suppose the contrary. Let's imagine that Iran has become a democratic state that has good relations with Israel and open economically, and it stops its support to terrorism, even Al-Qaeda. If this scenario takes place and Iran changes, the strategic value of Saudi Arabia in the world will decline and not increase, because without crises, the value of countries comes down. So the reality is that if I have to choose between two crises, I'm asking the Iraqis, if I have to choose between a strong personality like Saudi Arabia who threatens Saudi Arabia, if I was to choose between Saddam Hussein and chaos in Iraq, I would choose. I could not hear what he said. If I was to choose between solving the crisis in Syria and I would say that the region is between two poles, Saudi Arabia and Iran, that are blackmailing all the countries, and they can affect even the development of these countries. On the other side, China, Russia are selling arms and second-hand spare parts to China with the knowledge of the United States. So the major powers are benefiting from all these crises. And consequently, we are also benefiting from the smaller countries. Today, if it wasn't for the crisis in Lebanon, one couldn't have intervened there. Today, I can put Iran into an attrition war that is costly for the budget of Iran, and it's difference between handing the rebels RPG-9 and some spare parts that were sent in and some anti-aircraft and anti-armors that are Russian that I will buy from Ukraine, Russia would give it to Ukraine. Ukraine would buy it to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia would send it to the rebels to destroy a tank that costs 10,000 more than 10 times more than the cost of the RPG. Iran is benefiting today. Iran is looking to wants to have influence. The influence for Iran is different from the influence of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wants the economic influence it's the biggest investor in Syria, in Morocco, in Lebanon, and by this it gets political leverage and influence. And while unlike the Iranian leverage, which gave Iran nothing but a lot of expenditure and a lot of budget that has to spend there, and in fact the Iranian leverage is exhausting the capabilities of Iran and its economy. That's why today we are speaking about leverage and influence. My paper, in fact, discusses the details of negotiations. The negotiations confront the issues such as the Iranian nuclear program. This is something that cannot be chambered. Iraq cannot use light water instead of heavy water. This is unchangeable. So the Iranian nuclear project faces or confronts several things because Iran is unlike USA, and in USA the Congress and the intelligence services confront are in contradictory to what Mr. Obama is doing, and that's why Russia could get into Ukraine like that. The weakness of decision making and trying to Saudi Arabia to attempts to get some projects through this negotiation does not lead to any historical agreement with Iran or any historical agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, as Obama wishes. Mr. Obama looks into this as something possible, and that the components, the council of experts that brought Rouhani to power, who is even stronger than the guide, it is this council that designates the guide. This council of experts is the Khomeini, just like Khomeini, they have toppled the communists and sent them to prison, whereas they were with Khomeini in prisons. Khomeini sent them back to prison, and today they know very well that they have turned against this revolution in Iran, and in coordination with the intelligence of U.S. intelligence. Last point, somebody yesterday said that USA could not accept the disappearance of Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran had taken some national and sovereign decisions that he paid a price for, beginning from stopping the gas projects or the gas exploration. These were American companies, 40%, and the others all Western, and then they stopped the project of the underground subway. This has caused, with the knowledge of the Saudi intelligence, Americans designated a research center to study and give its ideas. These research centers recommended that the Shah should disappear because he is getting stronger and stronger and competing with Saudi Arabia. As for Yemen, Yemen is considered an area of possible problems in the future for Saudi Arabia. That's why it should not be given the opportunity to be stable, and Yemen should always have wars to be, so that it cannot achieve any economic or social development that might be harmful to Saudi Arabia. As for Iraq, Iraq is a danger and for Saudi, and Iraq's development should be hindered, especially educational side. All that was in this paper has been implemented during the past 30 years. We must be ready for what the United States wants to do in this region. it was push us into an arms race, nuclear arms race. We must be ready for many things because they will allow for Iran to be nuclear, just as they allowed Pakistan to be a nuclear power. شكرا دكتور نشكر thank you Dr. Zubaydi for your analysis and for the maybe that are some of the points he suggested are contrary to what Dr. Hamid said, but we wish that that will lead to many questions and the discussions that will take place a few minutes from now. Sorry to apologize to the panelists that I am pushing on them for time. Now I give the floor to Dr. Kadir Ustun from Turkey. He will be speaking about the role of Turkey in the American strategy regarding the Middle East. So now we are to listen to the Turkish point of view through Dr. Kadir Ustun, who is Director of Research in the Center of SETA Center in Washington, D.C., and he is also a journalist in assistant editor-in-chief in a magazine published by this center that focuses on policies. Mr. Ustun obtained a PhD in studies about Africa and Asia from Columbia University in New York, and his master's degree from Turkey in history. I hope that he will respect the time limit, and I'm sorry I have to push him for the time, and now we can.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I want to first thank Azmi Bashar and Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for inviting us here to talk about the Middle East and U.S. policy. I was asked to talk about Turkey's role in the U.S. strategy toward the Middle East. I'll make some general comments and then move on to discuss some specific policy issues with regards to Egypt, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and if I have time, maybe on Israel. The U.S. strategy in the Middle East is going through a period of readjustment. It's focused on reducing America's resources committed to the region, and it's asking regional players to take more responsibility. As the U.S. seeks to reduce its liabilities and investment in the region, Turkey, as a regional power, finds itself faced with greater responsibilities, but also greater costs and risks. The U.S. is not pulling out from the region, but it's reconsidering its leadership role. The current administration doesn't want to be leading in trying to solve the political problems in the region. But when it comes to security cooperation, the U.S. is actually strengthening its alliances in the region. We can see this happening in Lebanon, Jordan, and in the Gulf. This means that there's a vacuum in terms of regional leadership, and no single power has been capable of filling this void. Egypt has been consumed with internal power problems. Syria and Iraq are consumed with civil wars. Saudi Arabia is too fixated on the Iranian threat. And Iran has been challenging the U.S. instead of playing a constructive role in the region. And Turkey tries to play a leadership role, but its capacity has been limited to overcome the kind of challenges we face in the region. So when these regional powers cannot come to an agreement over regional issues, the U.S. will be unable to bring solutions, impose solutions. From the U.S. perspective, Turkey is a strong ally that it can rely on. During the Cold War, Turkey was a bulwark against communism. Until the 2000s, Turkey closely aligned its policy with the West. It's part of NATO, it's a candidate for EU membership, and it's part of the transatlantic alliance. In the past decade or so, since Turkey said no to Iraq's invasion by the US in 2003, Turkey has sought to increase its engagement with the Middle East through economic integration and political engagement. It crafted zero problems with neighbors policy, which was meant to change Turkey's security-focused and reactive foreign policy toward the Middle East. This has resulted in disagreements with the US, such as Hamas's election in Palestine in 2006, but it also produced some positive results with in terms of US-Turkey relations, such as Turkey's brokering of Syrian-Israeli talks. Turkey's vision for the region is that only governments that are responsive to the legitimate demands of their peoples can bring peace and stability to the region. Autocracy hasn't served the Middle East, and it needs to be confronted. Arab revolutions, Arab Spring showed that stability at the expense of democracy doesn't work. And the region has to confront the leaders like Assad, Maliki, and Sisi. They create not only repressive regimes, but they create instability in the region. With the onset of the Arab Spring, Turkey was confronted with a choice between authoritarian regimes and people power movements. Turkey made a difficult but a strategic choice by distancing itself from these repressive regimes and sided with the popular uprisings. This was a risky choice and a break from the traditional defensive posture of Turkish foreign policy. But today, the promise of the Arab revolutions has yielded to a counter-revolution, particularly in Egypt and Syria. So this limits Turkey's influence and policy choices. Turkey continues to oppose the counter-revolution and support democratic demands, but it also has to now prioritize national security risks, particularly emanating from Syrian crisis. This sort of status quo in this region is unsustainable, and I think the US is aware of it. But US sort of the legacies of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, combined with long-standing policy of supporting authoritarianism for regional stability, shape US policy in such a way that it prevents it from insisting on democratic transitions. If we discuss Egypt, when Egyptian revolution happened, AK Party, the current ruling party in Turkey, is democratic as a party that was democratic conservative with an Islamist background. They thought that Muslim Brotherhood could follow in a similar fashion, lead Egypt into a democratic process. But the political power struggle in the country rendered this prospect impossible, as the coup under Sisi has been undertaking a political purge against the Muslim Brotherhood. In September 2011, commenting on his vision for the Turkish-Egyptian relationship, Foreign Minister Davutoğlu spoke of an axis of democracy between the two biggest nations in our regions, from the north to the south, from the Black Sea to the Nile Valley in Sudan. So a strategic alliance with a strong Egypt would have contributed to stability in the region. But the coup against the first elected Egyptian president eliminated that chance of a strong possibility of a strong Turkey-Egypt strategic relationship, at least in the short term. And that would have also helped Egypt's successful transition to democracy. That would have, in turn, allowed integration of Islamist actors into the legitimate democratic process. But that seems like a dim prospect right now. When it comes to Syrian revolution, so on Egypt, both the US prioritizes now its security interests, and Turkey remains on the more pro-revolution side. So it has created disagreements between the two allies. When we talk about Syria, at the beginning of the Syrian revolution, both the US and Turkey called on Assad to step down, and the regime once the regime cracked down on the peaceful protesters, both the US and Turkey decided to support the Syrian opposition, but their policies were generally broadly aligned, especially at the beginning. But they started to diverge in their approach to the conflict as the revolution became highly militarized and turned into a civil war with armed groups with diverse ideological goals and military capacities. With the advance of al-Qaeda-related groups, the focus now has shifted toward containing and confronting the terrorist groups. And Assad regime has benefited from this shift of focus. The US, Turkey, along with the core group of Friends of Syria, they failed to forge a comprehensive strategy aimed at political transition in Syria. So the international community is confronted with a much more complex situation with the emergence of terrorist groups, possibility of a war of attrition, and a de facto breakup of Syria. US has supported Turkey politically and diplomatically in the face of security threats and risks from Syria, but it's been less forthcoming in taking the lead in forging an international effort to end the Syria conflict. So consequently, both countries will have to work piecemeal on containing the hazards of the conflict rather than approaching the crisis as a whole. As US policy on Syria concerned itself with the elimination of chemical weapons and limiting the influence of radical groups, the broader question of how to resolve the Syrian crisis was put on the back burner. So there is acceptance among US administration that the US cannot bring an end to the conflict and it simply has to deal with its spillover effects. This policy is actually contrary to Obama administration's declared goal of regime change and transition in Syria. Turkey remains committed to that declared policy of regime change also, but it also recognizes that conflict is not going to end anytime soon. And Turkey has been also focused on containing the spillover effects and managing the refugee crisis. When it comes to in Iraq, Turkey has strong relations with the Kurdish regional government, and it's become a highly Turkish-dependent region in terms of its economy. Turkey has helped in the past Sunnis to organize politically and push them to be part of the government, but Maliki's exclusionary policies caused the current situation in Iraq. The US hasn't been able to pressure Maliki, and Maliki has proven unwilling to be more inclusive. So Turkey feels it has no choice but to seek after its security and energy interests in Iraq. Both countries have to manage their differences over KRG, Maliki, and terrorism threat in the short term. And in the long run, managing Iraq's slip into Iran's orbit and a deepening civil war are a concern for Turkey and the US. With respect to relations with Iran, Turkish-Iranian relations have always been somewhat ambiguous or difficult since competition and cooperation often went in hand. Today, while Iran and Turkey have strong disagreements over the Syrian civil war, and they support diametrically opposing groups, they cooperate on energy issues. Turkey's dependence on outside energy sources requires a level of cooperation with Iran and Russia also. Turkey positioned itself as a mediator in nuclear negotiations between the West and Iran, but the US refusal to consider the Tehran Declaration in 2010 created a short-term short-term crisis in US-Turkey relations. And Turkey has long supported engagement instead of confrontation with Iran. So a potential nuclear deal between the West and Iran could contribute to lessening of regional tensions. Threats of sanctions and war against Iran has led to regional instability, which in turn prevents economic interdependence and trade activity, which Turkey wants to promote. The potential for Iran and Turkey to cooperate remains relevant for regional peace and stability, as well as economic development. The US policy, however, has long been based on confronting Iran until recently over its nuclear policy. This posture may be changing thanks to the potential nuclear deal, and if that were to happen, Iran may be more open to adopt a more constructive posture on regional issues, especially in Syria. So overall, US policy toward the Middle East will remain cautious and minimalist under the Obama administration, and the US will try to avoid taking big risks and heavy costs. But that burden, those risks will have to be transferred over to regional allies such as Turkey. The US will be more and more unwilling to take the leading role, at least under this administration. So this posture, however, runs the risk of losing sight of the broader policy goals, which might create disagreements and crises between US and the US regional allies like Turkey. So US policy is not always clear about what it seeks to accomplish, as we have witnessed last year when the US backed away from punishing Assad for using chemical weapons in Syria. So increasingly minimalist and hesitant US attitude may prevent high level of cooperation between the US and Turkey. But I don't have time for Israel, so maybe in Q&A I can talk about that if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kadir Ustun, for your presentation. Now we have 15 minutes only. I'll divide them into two parts. The first 10 minutes for questions, and maybe towards the end I'll allow I'll take 3 questions or comments, no more, and that will leave us some time towards the end for the panelists to respond.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. I learned so much. I have a couple of questions about Russia and Iran. What would it take, Mr. Parker, in your opinion, to sway Russia's position in Syria, especially Saudi Arabia playing the swaying actor? And about Iran, you stated, Mr. Hamid, that the United States, with the help of Saudi Arabia perhaps, presented the Iranian revolution as of being a Shi'i revolution. What would you say to someone who would say that the Iranian revolution itself represented itself as a Shi'i revolution? It states in the constitution that it follows al-Madhab al-Ithnay Ashari, the Shi'i form of Islam. It states that in its discourse of power, it emphasizes the idea of madlumiyya, the oppression. And it states that Wilayat al-Faqih is the right form of government. Even Ahmadinejad in New York, I remember when I was in the state, he started his speech actually by praying for the return of al-Imam, the 12th Imam. Thank you.
شكرا. تفضل الأستاذ الأفندي.
Thank you for the speakers. It's a good job that Dr. Dabashi is on the panel, because the borders between fiction and reality have really blurred in some presentations. I wouldn't dwell on that, but I want to pose a question about the U.S. policy in Iraq and Iran, because I think the real question is, how does the U.S. think, the U.S. diplomacy think? I think it was obvious, for example, for most of us that when the U.S. wanted to invade Iraq, that this would help Iran. I remember commenting at the time that if I was a follower of Khomeini, I would argue that this is part of the karamat of the Ayatollah, that all the things he wanted to do, hitting Taliban, weakening Saudi Arabia, ending Saddam Hussein, has been done by America for him. So that was obvious for us. What was obvious for the American policy? It was also obvious for everybody that the way Maliki was doing his policies in Iraq was going to lead to a debacle. So what were they thinking? I don't know if anybody can enlighten us in the audience or in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Shukran. دكتور تفضل.
شكرا جزيلا. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Al-Khilali Al-Anani, sorry. I disagree with Dr. Omar that I think it's an oversimplification that the American policy creates crises. This is escaping reality. We have our own crises from Iraq to Morocco. I think we are trying to escape the reality, and this is highly defective academically. We are in an academic conference. We want academic analysis. We are not here just to talk aimlessly. Of course, there are strategic interests. America is not happy with these crises. On the contrary, these crises drag more into trouble. And also, this is the position of some regimes which are counter-revolutionary. They are against the Arab revolutions. They are trying to portray these revolutions as artificial ones created by outside powers. Also, you say, what if Iran turned into a democratic country? Will this end the crisis? I put it to you, what if Saudi Arabia became a democratic state? Will that end the crisis? Also, when someone said that Khamenei is a leader of the entire Muslim world, this is something I don't understand. Last question, please. السلام عليكم. اسام عبد الشافي. Please, there's two speakers speaking at the same time. We cannot hear them in translation. We missed the first part of the question. He said, Zubaydi, he said, countries cannot exist without crisis. I say, with crisis, countries will disappear. He says, if he was given the choice between confrontation and Saddam Hussein or chaos, he will choose chaos. I think even if we disagree on Saddam, we will think the opposite. He says the Saudis managed to make Iran enter a war of attrition in Syria. I think the opposite is true. Iran has managed to drag Saudi Arabia Arabia and exhausted, and now they are surrounding Saudi from all angles. Dr. Zubaydi is talking about Saudi Arabia as if it is a totally independent country when it comes to foreign policy. But I think in my long study of the Saudi Arabia, Saudis are not but tools in the hands of a foreign power. A general observation, I had the opportunity to attend the first day's sessions and today's sessions, and I unfortunately to say that there are many papers which are very shallow and not objective. And I have 5 minutes left. I will give each panelist for a minute and a half, starting with Dr. John Parker, and then Dr. Hamid, then Dr. Zubaydi, and Mr. Ustun.
Yes, well, thank you for the question. I don't see much change coming in the Russian position on Syria shortly. But I would like to point out that Russia has been surprised by its success in Syria. However, from the very beginning, Russian analysts knew that there was a strong core of support for Assad. They also thought that back in 2011 that Russia was on its way out of the Middle East. So Assad's success in holding his own in Damascus has come as a surprise, and it's been very beneficial to Putin for his domestic ratings. It is a very cheap option for Russia to keep supporting Assad. They have their veto power in the UN Security Council, a legacy of the Soviet era. And what they are supplying in arms to Assad is hardly a blip in terms of the Russian arms stocks. And they can do this without interference because they're moving them in Russian Navy ships that basically have freedom of the seas to keep supplying Assad. So any change in the Russian position in Syria is going to be as a result of changes in Syria itself.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Hamid?
Just in a minute and a half, thank you for the excellent question. First of all, I did not say Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had no influence on the Iranian Revolution, number one. Number two, I said there were a combination of internal dynamics and external dynamics. Internal dynamics had to do with the competition among opposing factions, nationalists, socialists, and the Islamists. I'm not saying, I don't like the term secular. I don't think the revolution was secular, but the revolution was the combination of all these forces. And the role of the United States in the aftermath of the success of the revolution, so far as the Iran-Iraq war, and then the Afghan mobilization of the Wahhabis in Afghanistan was concerned, exacerbated that internal. That's number one. Number two, your point about Ahmadinejad and the constitution, these are ex post facto. That is, here we have to begin to talk about the details. As of the summer of 1979, when Khomeini was alive and the first draft of the constitution was offered for deliberation, there was no Velayat Faqih. Ayatollah Khomeini introduced Velayat Faqih in July of 1979, when in Tehran University people began to debate the terms of the constitution, and he realized that there are forces endemic to the revolutionary mobilization that didn't want to have an Islamic republic. Sanjabi went to Nufl Shado and asked him to drop the term Islamic from the Islamic Republic. Mustafa Rahimi wrote a fantastic article acknowledging the significance and necessity of the revolution, but the title of the essay was Why I Oppose an Islamic Republic. So here we are talking about the details and systematic transmutation of a multifaceted revolution, which included Islamists, included the followers of Ayatollah Khomeini. But they were, even the Islamists were not only the followers of Ayatollah Khomeini. There were many Shariati followers, there were very Mutahari followers, there were very Al-Ahmad followers also, while Khomeini was in exile. So yes, by the time Ahmadinejad comes to think, of course he sees the 12th Imam. But I'm talking about much earlier phases of the revolution, which was predicated on purges in the university, cultural revolutions, mass executions in prisons that then, so I put the emphasis more internal than the external, but externally it exacerbated. Just one 30 seconds apropos the equally important question regarding what were the, of course, I completely concur that the US-led invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were completely in favor of, I mean, whether it was designed that way or ended that way, that's a different question, in strengthening the Iranian position in the region. However, soon after the US-led invasion of Iraq, Israelis began to mobilize their influence within Washington about the nuclear issue. And even during the time of Wolfowitz, the expression in Washington, D.C. was, everybody can go to Afghanistan, Iraq, but only men go to Iran. That they were beating the drum of military invasion of Iran even up to that point. And
thank you.
Simply, no, just 15 seconds.
That's
15,
more than 2 minutes.
The terms of warfare are changing. The assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, crippling sanctions, etc., are also forms of war. Thank you.
Thank
sorry.
you. Dr. Zobidy, بدقيقة واحدة رجاء.
This meeting, this conference is not for entertainment. We must be precise and distinction with journalistic talk and what is strategic talk. There is the treatment of crises and through crises. Maybe you didn't listen to me well enough. I did not speak about, I did not say that U.S. does nothing but create crises, as was the case in Iraq or other crises, economic and non. USA benefits from these crises, and so that it can put into implementation its policies and make some economic benefits. As for the revolutions, I'm not shedding doubt on these revolutions, but as Iran and Saudi Arabia had intervened in the real Syrian revolution, there are some revolutions that the United States had launched. I'm thinking about the beginnings of the revolutions. I'm not talking about the beginnings of the revolution, no, how they were completed. As in Iran, I did not say there's democracy in Iran. I spoke about complete change in Iran's policies regarding dealing with al-Qaeda, intervention, confrontation, creating wars, etc. This is the change that they had. As for the change in the position of the Emir of Kuwait, in fact, the diplomatic relations between the Gulf countries and even their intelligence coordination, there is an office of coordination to intelligence of Saudi Arabia and Iran. This has not stopped, no, it's always been there.
Thank you. There was no direct question, but
the
I'll just
over,
simply
the time is
repeat what I said already. But with the Arab Spring, we now know that people of the region, not necessarily the regimes, they don't want to. They want representative governments that are responsive to their demands, and this current wave of counter-revolution cannot sustain itself in the long run. So we have to, regional powers, Egypt, Iran, and Turkey, and Saudi, they have to come to some sort of agreement that counter-revolution should not be here to stay, and it won't be here to stay, and you need to establish governments that are responsive to people's demands, with or without U.S. cooperation or blessing on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shukran jazilan. Before announcing the end of the session, I would like to apologize to my colleagues, the panelists. I was a bit rough with them about respecting the time limit, because I promised the organizers to finish by 1 o'clock. What we heard in this session was very important, with the differences in opinions, but no matter how different we are in our opinions, we should not describe this by this is only rhetoric, and maybe you have different points of view about this or that issue, especially that we are now treating issues regarding the relations with the Arabs and USA. I thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance and for your attentive listening, and we are waiting for another session in a minute. Thank you.